In today's workplace, 4 generations are vying for the rightful places at the conference table, and every day, roles are being rewritten and rules are all over the mat. Millennials are flooding the workplace at an ever-increasing rate. Generation Xers have paid their dues and are looking to climb the corporate ladder, but the average boomer has no plans to retire anytime soon. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Scott Zimmer is an associate at Bridgeworks LLC, the company that wrote the best-selling business books When Generations Collide, Who They Are, Why They Clash, How to Solve the Generational Puzzle at Work, and the M Factor. For our session today, Scott will outline how to reconcile these facts across generational lines and simultaneously foster collaboration and understanding among the different cohorts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Generation Xer, Scott Zimmer. Scott?
Thank you so much. Thank you. See, the front rows are always empty. I'm telling you, I have to start bringing like t-shirts and candy and different kinds of prizes to throw out to encourage people to want to sit up front. Well, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I came all the way from beautiful Minneapolis, Minnesota. Has anyone been to Minnesota? All right. For the rest of you who haven't, by the way, hopefully when you went there it was not winter. It was the summertime. For the rest of you, you'll notice the Minnesota accent from time to time. I've already been mistaken for a Canadian a couple times. It's going to happen. Last week somebody asked me if I was an extra in the movie Fargo. I think she was joking, but I get it. So it's a thick O, like out and about. You'll pick up on it. Just try not to make fun of me. I'm very sensitive to it. I have to say, one of my favorite parts about this job, researching and studying the topic of generations, I've been doing it for years, has got to be that wherever I'm presenting, whatever the industry, whatever the field, whether it's finance, hospitality, plant pathology, it makes no difference. I could be in a room full of corporate CEOs or 19-year-old interns. The topic of working across generations is something everyone can identify with, because at one point or another, we have all experienced that moment where we fail to connect with another generation. And when we have those moments where we fail to connect, right away, instinctively, we tend to go to a place of frustration, a place of negativity. We stereotype. We tend to think about who's an entitled brat, or we might think about who needs to get with the times, rather than find ways where we can come together to bring our different perceptions and perspectives and talents to the table to get the job done. And maybe actually, if we're not careful, have a little bit of fun in the process, like the two do so well in this commercial I want to show you.
Stuart, can I see you in my office, please?
That kid is sick. That hinge is squeaky. He's very sick.
Stuart, get in here.
Sure thing, Mr. P.
Stuart, I just opened my Ameritrade account.
Let's light this candle. Let's go to Ameritrade.com. It's easier than falling in love. What do you feel like buying today, Mr. P?
Kmart.
So research it. All this stuff is provided for you free of charge.
No cost.
Yeah, that's synonymous with free.
Looks like a good stock.
Let's buy.
Let's buy 100 shares.
All right, click it in there.
Okay.
How about 500?
100, Stuart.
You feel the excitement? You're about to buy a stock
Okay.
online.
Oh, fabulous. I'm thrilled. What did that cost me?
$8, my man.
$8?
$8. You're riding the wave of the future, my man. I gotta get a soda.
All right.
I'm sorry, Mr. P. I'm having a party on Saturday night if you really want to go.
I'm going to try and get there. Thank
Happy
you, Stuart.
trading.
Thank you.
Rock on.
All right, Stuart.
A show of hands, how many of you actually remember those Stewart commercials from the late 90s? A few of you. Ameritrade released those into the marketplace in the late 90s, and they got a huge reaction. It won some awards. People were writing in saying, this is actually when people wrote in to things, by the way. People were writing in saying, this is so great. I'm totally the Stewart at my office, or I'm the Mr. P where I work. I have seen this commercial hundreds of times, and I always try and include it in every workshop, presentation, training that I do because, well, one, I think it's funny, and two, I think it does something so well that we see so seldom today, especially in the media. What it's doing is it's showing two very distinctly different generations coming together to get the job done. And you know what? It isn't pulling teeth. And that's the whole point of what we're going to be talking about today. It doesn't have to be. You know what else I love about that commercial too? When Stuart hands Mr. P the flyer, which by the way, you can tell Stuart is a Gen Xer because he has a flyer. I love the throwback feel of that. He says, you know, I'm going to have a party on Saturday, and Mr. P says, well, I'm going to try and get there. Stuart doesn't say, but you know what, if you could lose the tie, maybe throw on some jeans, kind of loosen up a little bit. It's all about each of them accepting the other for who they are. Anyway, I want to take a step back, and I want to talk to you a little bit about who these different generations are that we study at Bridgeworks. The first generation we're going to talk about today are the traditionalist generation. They're sometimes known as the silent generation, or if anyone in here has ever read or heard of Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, this is who he's talking about. It's that World War II, Great Depression era generation. And they're born prior to 1946. Here in the United States, they were born into a group of 75 million. Now, show of hands. I always like to get a sense of who's in the room with me. Do I have any traditionalists here today? You can bump yourself up or down. I'm not going to know the difference. Traditionalists actually make up a pretty small percentage of the workforce today. Many have since retired, but their legacy is huge. They have helped grow and build so many institutions across the globe that they're a generation, and we see their influence every day all around us, even though we don't even realize it. So it's a generation I still love talking about. So welcome to all the traditionalists here with me. Next, I have a feeling I'm going to see a few more hands with this one. The baby boomer generation, born between 1946 and 1964. They are a huge generation across the globe. Here in the United States alone, they were a group of 80 million. Statistically speaking, there was a baby born every 8 seconds during the formative years of the baby boomer generation. Big generation. Let's forget the hands. I can barely see you guys. Round of applause if you're a boomer. All right, welcome. Don't get too rowdy. Next, we have my generation. I can't pick favorites, but if I had to, it would be Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1979, we are a tiny generation across the globe. In the United States alone, we are 20 million less than the generation above us. Let me hear it. Gen Xers, where are you at? All right. It used to be when we were younger, we had more of an apathetic way about us, so we tended to be like. So I'm glad that we're starting to, be a little more gleeful. I like that. Last but certainly not least, the millennial generation, born between 1980 and 1995, one of the most populous generations across the globe, depending on which country you're from. In the United States, according to our last census, with immigration, the millennials have now surpassed the baby boomers in population. They're at 82 million and growing. Millennials, where are you at? All right. When I started doing this years ago, and there weren't as many millennials in the workforce, didn't matter if I was in a conference room or an auditorium, there was always like 4 or 5 millennials who would just kind of put their hand up, and they would look really bashful. They sort of had this look on their face like, I'm sorry. Because they were just worried that the whole hour was just going to be a rant about their generation. I promise that's not going to be the case, and I'm glad so many millennials are here to represent. Let me ask you this. How many of you feel as though you are smack dab in the middle of one of those generations that we talked about? You feel as though maybe you've got 1 foot in one generation and 1 foot in the other. All right, that's okay. At Bridgeworks, you're what we call a cusper. We've written 2 books. In our first book, When Generations Collide, there's a whole section on cuspers. It's called Cusper the Friendly Ghost. And thank you. I didn't write it, but thank you. And actually, the title works on a couple different levels. Cuspers oftentimes feel invisible or a little left out of this whole generational conversation that's going on because they don't solely identify with one generation or another. They're not quite sure where they fit, so they don't know that they really have a lot of valuable insight. When in fact, we have found that cuspers play a big part in what we're talking about. Cuspers are, it's not a real word, but let's just go with it, generationally bilingual, meaning that they're great translators and they're really good at seeing 2 different perspectives and 2 different sides. when it comes to generational clashes that can happen in the workplace. They might be those people after a meeting who have to say things like, hey, Bob, what Jason meant to say in the meeting when he said that to you was this. He wasn't trying to be offensive. So if you are a cusper, know that you play a very important part in what we're doing here today. Another thing I want to point out is that what we're looking at are dates, population sizes, we're talking about ages. Generational theory is more than just numbers, and it is more than just putting people into a box. Generational theory is it's what got me into this in the first place, because I think it is so fascinating. Generational theory all stems back to the events and conditions of our formative years. That's really what generational theory is, and what I mean by that is, what was going on in the world when you were coming of age? When you were an adolescent, you're going through brain development, you're 13, 14 years old. And what's happening in the world around you during that time has a profound and lasting impact on how you see the world. It shapes your traits, your values, how you perceive things like right and wrong, your work ethic, social justice, all of it. And it's those traits that we develop during our formative years that we end up carrying with us our entire lives, right into the workplace. So today, rather than just talk about the what's when it comes to generations, I want to talk about the whys. I want to talk about not just these traits and values that we all have and how we can sometimes clash. We are going to talk about that. I want to take it a step further with you. I want to talk about why. Where do those traits come from? Where do those different outlooks and mindsets come from? Why do some of us get motivated by different things? Why do some of us respond one way to a form of feedback and others respond differently? We're going to talk about where that all comes from to create a little bit of an understanding across generations. Another thing I want to point out too, generational theory is a sociological study. You're studying a group of people over a period of time. So, like, psychology is more studying us and who we are as individuals. My point is, some of what we talk about today, you are going to identify with. You're going to say, that is so me. Or you're going to look next to you and say, that is so you. And some of it maybe you won't identify with. That is okay, and that's normal. That's the nature of any sociological study. I would just encourage you to really pull from the things that you do identify with. Psychology really talks about us as individuals, and a lot goes into making up who we are. It could be our gender, our socioeconomic background, our birth order. There's a lot that goes into it. And a big one that I want to point out is where we were born, where we were raised. I have a very global audience with me here today. With over 200 countries in the world, I have 49 of them represented here today. That's 49 different places to grow up with different sets of circumstances when it comes to what went on during our formative years and what kind of lasting effect that has on us. So I want you to keep that in mind today, that while some of this might seem to skew a little US, I want you to think about your own set of formative events. The TV shows you remember, the big world events that impacted who you are. Because every different culture had their own unique set of events that help shape who they are. So, one of the biggest, I would say, deterrents that happens when we're trying to really connect across generations is we stereotype. It tends to be our go-to, tends to be our default. Let me give you an example. Right now, millennials are that, oh, I got ahead of myself. I wanted to quick show you this too because we're talking about having that global perspective. I mentioned traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials across the globe, and I just picked 6 different countries here. These generations go by many, many different names. For instance, in the UK, my generation, Generation X, were known as Thatcher's children. In India, baby boomers were known as the free generation. So again, that global perspective is really important because it's always different depending on where you are. And because we only have an hour together, we're not going to really be able to take that deep global dive that I would like to take. So just something to keep in mind. And for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to use traditionalists, baby boomer, Generation Xer, and millennial today. So millennials, you are the generation that is in the hot seat right now. across the globe, you are a hot topic. People are really trying to figure out what makes your generation tick, what motivates you, how to recruit, how to retain, how to involve you. But I have to say, in terms of stereotypes, millennials are a generation that have, I'd say, a lot of bad PR going on right now. Do me a favor. Throw out a few words that you would feel, that you think describe this generation. And millennials, throw a few out there that you feel your generation gets pegged with. What are some words that come to mind when you think of millennials? I just, out of all of that, lazy really stood out. What else? Distracted. Video games. Idealistic. Very good. Entitled. That's usually the first one I hear. Entitled and lazy, and then maybe tech savvy or tech dependent, overshares, and it goes from there. Basically, it's not exactly a greatest hits list. You know, it generally starts negative and goes from there, and a lot of millennials are like, hey, you know I can hear you, right? I'm right here. So, across the globe right now, millennials, you've got a pretty bad reputation. But here's the thing. I have found that it is those organizations, scratch that, it's those individuals who are learning to work past these different headlines, these different stereotypes, and get to the heart of who this generation is. Those individuals who are learning to work with millennials and not against them, that are finding the most success. And I'm going to tell you why it's so important that people are doing that today. There is a generational demographic shift that is happening across the globe. 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every single day. And let me tell you, by 2020, millennials are going to comprise 50% of the American workforce. In just a few short years, half of the workforce in this country. On a global scale, by 2025, millennials will comprise 75% of the global workforce. Learning to work with this generation is more important than ever. So we asked the question of millennials, what is one thing you wish your manager knew about how you work? And we asked that question of millennials across the globe. And I wanted to just share a couple of the different answers that we received. This first one comes from Boston. It is so motivating for me when my manager asks for my opinion. Even though I know he makes the final decision, it makes me feel like a crucial part of the team when I get to weigh in. I think all managers could tap into that. This next one comes from London. I wish my manager knew that I go to her for help because I trust her opinion and I want to be better. I think there are so many stereotypes out there about needy millennials. Nah. This isn't me being needy. This is me asking for guidance I need in order to deliver better results. And this one is from India. I have an awesome manager. He knows exactly how to motivate our group. He lets us have fun, gives us some freedom, but he knows how to set boundaries. Sometimes we need that. I'll admit sometimes we're a bit too friendly of a group, but that's what makes working here so fun. So those are just a few of the different answers we have gotten from millennials across the globe about what do you wish your manager knew about how you like to work. So before we go even deeper into this generation, I want to take a step back and I want to talk about the baby boomer generation. There were so many baby boomers in here today. I want to take some time and I want to talk about your generation and what motivates you and how you came to be who you are. So personally, I could do a whole speech just on the baby boomer generation, and I'll tell you why. This is a generation that has redefined every single life stage that they touched. Youth culture, work culture, and today, retirement are all completely different than they were before baby boomers hit that life stage. It's quite something. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the formative years of the baby boomer generation. Who is this generation? What shaped them? And I think it would, personally, be a wasted opportunity for me to stand up here and tell you about your generation. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to come to you. Millennials, you won't get this reference, but this is my Phil Donahue moment. Thank you. Millennials, if you want to Wikipedia, Phil Donahue was a talk show host in the 1980s. And his whole shtick was going into the audience with the microphone. So, there you are. So boomers, I want you to think about wherever you're from. What were some of those big memories, those big events, the songs you loved, the bands you loved, the things that really stuck with you from your formative years? And I want you to put your hands up. Chances are I might have to stick kind of close to the aisle, so forgive me for that. But we have a gentleman right here. What's your name, sir?
Emilio. Beatles and Vietnam.
Beatles and Vietnam. Boomers, who in here remembers Beatlemania? It was such a distinctive part of this generation. Youth culture, the music, Woodstock. Here in the United States, it was, I mean, if we can be so blunt, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll was the big thing, right? But Beatlemania was huge. Who in here remembers their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show when they crossed the pond? That was a big deal. And then you also mentioned Vietnam. In the United States especially, when I'm in a room full of baby boomer men, and they say things to me like, I had a gentleman the other day, he said he remembered his draft number and then said it out loud. I get chills because as a Gen Xer, I don't relate to that from my formative years. As millennials, chances are you have nothing to compare that to. When they talk about watching the lottery in the evening news to see if their number was called, turning 18 was something very different for that generation than it was for my generation. And it was the first time a lot of people spoke out against a war. That's something that was very distinctive of the baby boomer generation. It's almost as though in many parts of the world they said to their parents, Mom and Dad, I love you, but something's got to change. This is a generation that fought against things they saw as unjust, whether that was women's rights, civil rights, voting rights. And they fought hard for that. Protests, rallies, marches, sit-ins, bra burnings, you name it. Boomers fought for change. Absolutely. Thank you for that, sir. Who else? I'm going to go back here. Feel free to stand up, sir.
My name's Doug. I'm from Detroit, so it was Motown music and the Detroit City riots, or urban riots in general.
All right. What do you remember, if you don't mind? Hold on to that.
Sure.
What do you remember about the riots? What was distinctive? How did that impact you?
Well, I had an uncle who was in the Michigan National Guard, and he was called down to Detroit. And of all my uncles that served in the military service, he's the only one that actually got shot at, and it was in the streets of Detroit. Wow. My uncle who went to Vietnam was on an Air Force base and never saw a bullet. So, yeah, it was pretty close to home.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Fellow Midwesterner, too, by the way, which I appreciate. Who do we have here? Juliet?
Juliet Carroll. Burn the bra. Ban the bra.
Did you burn a bra?
No.
Oh. But you remember it.
But I wanted to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. What else? I don't know how far back I can go. All right. Yes, ma'am, we have Jean back here.
Yeah, Jean Ristino. I remember having nuclear weapon drills. We had to climb under our desks at school because, you know, an atom bomb might hit Washington, D.C.
Who in here, by a show of hands, remembers the duck and cover, I believe it was called? Did any of you, even as children, ever think to yourselves as you were huddled under the desk, how on earth is this going to protect me from a nuclear blast? But I want to point out sort of the juxtaposition of that's something you remember, that drill that you remember, and millennials today in the United States, what drill do they have? They have lockdowns in case there's a shooter. It's a completely different way of thinking and a completely different set of circumstances. Let me give you another example of that. One of my favorite parts of this job is that I get to interview so many different people from so many different generations. And when I interview baby boomers, I will ask the question, when I mention NASA to you, when I mention the space program, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And the steadfast answer I get from baby boomers is always the moon landing. Who in here remembers the moon landing? I asked a baby boomer, describe that to me. What was that like? It was before my time. They will tell me stories about getting up to watch it with their parents. I had a gentleman last week say, my grandma was sitting next to me, and she told me, I didn't see a car until I was 19 years old. I was already done with high school, and now I'm watching a man walk on the moon. This is a big deal. In the United States, there was a lot of pride that went with it. You know, we won the space race. You know, a lot of patriotism. It was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. A lot of boomers said there was a man on the moon. It was the idea that anything was possible. I asked the exact same question of Generation Xers. When I mention NASA to you, when I mention the space program, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Absolutely. It's the Challenger explosion is what I hear every single time. And you ask a Gen Xer, well, describe that. What was that like? You get a completely different set of adjectives and experiences. Well, I mean, I remember being a kid when that happened. I remember all the different homerooms in our class were put in the music room. We all sat cross-legged on the floor. They wheeled the TV in, which you knew was going to be a good day because there was no homework whenever there was a TV involved. And you're a kid. All the guys in my class, we wanted to be basketball players or astronauts. That was pretty much what it was. And there was a teacher on board, Krista McCullough, a teacher here in the United States. And when you're a little kid, you look up to teachers, so you're rooting for her. And to watch it explode on TV, live, in front of us, was confusing and sad and scary. And we remember seeing teachers crying, and we remember Ronald Reagan addressing the nation the next day. There was no one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was a whole different set of circumstances. It was whistleblowing and conspiracy theories. Here's my point. We're looking at the exact same institution, NASA. But here in the US, depending on your generational vantage point, you experienced it and you remember it very, very differently. And that's how impactful these different formative events and conditions can be. Anyway, I could stay down here all day and talk about boomer formative events because there are so many amazing things that happened during this time, but I don't want to run out of time. So thank you everybody who shared. Baby boomers are a generation that, amongst other things, given all their circumstances, are very optimistic, they're idealistic, and they are competitive. I want to talk about that competitiveness. Optimistic and idealistic. Around the globe, we started to see a lot of progression and a lot of change happen. And the idea in many parts of the world is if you work hard enough, anything's possible. But I want to talk about the competitiveness. I don't know if I have any competitive boomers here with me today, but I'm telling you, this is a competitive, a competitive generation. And what I found is that there's just so many of you across the globe that even dinner time, there was just more of you at the table. Everything was more competitive. I talked to baby boomers who said that when they would get to school, there weren't always enough textbooks for every kid. There weren't always enough desks and places to sit. The world wasn't ready for such a population boom. Traditionalists came back from war, started having families and kids, and across the globe, there was this huge population spike. The oil embargo here in the United States, I don't know who remembers that, but even putting gas in your car became competitive. You couldn't fill up on certain days of the week. And when boomers got to the workplace, there weren't always enough jobs. So this is a generation that didn't just reshape youth culture, it reshaped work culture. This is a generation that really, boomers would get to work before the boss did. And they would not leave until after the boss left. They were the generation that came up with the expression, you dress for the job you want, not the job you have. They turned the pretty standard 40-hour work week into the 50, 60, 70-hour work week. Thanks, boomers, by the way, for that one. I'm a big fan. I'm glad that one stuck around. But they knew if they didn't, there was a line of 80 million people behind them who would. That's how competitive things were. So they really changed the shape of work culture today. And one thing that was passed on to baby boomers from traditionalists is a style of communication that we still see today. It's a very top-down command and control style of communication. Traditionalists, 50% of them here in the US were veterans of either World War II or the Korean War. A lot of them had a very strong military background. So, boomers, you might be able to help me out with this. If your traditionalist boss said to you, jump, what was the right answer? You got it. How high? Today, ask a millennial to jump. And what are they going to say? Why? Or, you know what? I've got this whole new way of jumping. I want to talk to you about it because I think it could really be innovative for our organization. It's not a how high situation anymore. And how does that come across to older generations? Disrespectful, insubordinate, arrogant, whatever. But we have to ask ourselves, where does that instinct to ask why, to question, to speak up, where does that come from? I hate to disappoint you, but I've talked to many millennials over the years, and although what you might think, they do not wake up in the morning and think to themselves, how can I be disrespectful today? How can I be insubordinate? How can I really get under my boss's skin today? That's not what their MO is. So we have to ask ourselves, where does that instinct to question, to push back, to speak up, where does it come from? Let's look at how we were raised. Somebody, by the way, said parents. Boomers, let's look at how you were raised. Traditionalists raise their kids very differently. Children should be seen but not heard, absolutely. I don't want to say boomers grew up in a house that was a dictatorship, but someone was in charge in your house. In the United States, the #1 show for a brief period of time was Father Knows Best. You know, kids weren't invited to speak up and share their opinion and share their voice. And a lot of boomers, as they grew up and started to have families, they said, you know what? I don't want to raise my kids that way. I want my kids to have a say. I don't want them to be scared to speak up. So they started to give their kids a voice. And I talk to millennials who say, growing up, they had a big say in a lot of decisions that went on in their household. Big or small. What are we having for dinner tonight? To where are we going on vacation? As an extra, I never helped plan family vacations. Wherever we were going, that's where I went. But a lot of millennials told me that their parents would say, look, you know that dad likes golf and mom likes sightseeing and you kids like pools? Go online, find us some different options and come back and we'll talk about it from there. I spoke with a principal in the Minneapolis area. For years now, he's run a program called Pizza with the Principal, where once a month he invites about a half a dozen kids into his office, orders pizza, and they sit around and they talk. And he asks them, how do you think things are going? What do you think's working? What's not working? I got to tell you, when I got called to the principal's office when I was a kid, there was no pizza. It's a different way of doing things. My colleague Hannah, she's a millennial. She's a millennial. She's brilliant. Adore Hannah. She told me this story once that when she broke curfew in high school, she was sort of sneaking in the house, hoping her parents wouldn't catch her. And sure enough, they were waiting at the kitchen table. They said, sit down, young lady. So she sits down. They said, we're very disappointed in you. How do you think you should be punished? What? I said, what are you talking? I'm like, your parents made punishments collaborative? Oh yeah, I always get to have a say in my punishments. Boomers, Xers, did we get to sit down and, weigh the pros and cons of our punishments with our parents? No. We can hardly blame millennials today when they get to the workplace to want to speak up, ask questions, be heard, have a voice. We have been treating them as little consultants since they were 10 years old.
Hey, who's this?
Oh, that's Kyle. He aced his 5th grade geography class.
Huh.
You see, now that we're using FedEx to ship globally, I have to learn all the countries again, so I brought in Kyle as a consultant. Did you know that we have customers in Czechoslovakia?
Actually, it's called the Czech Republic.
Yes, Kyle. You are a lifesaver. Now, without Kyle, I never would have heard of that new country called Buttheadistan.
We understand you want to grow internationally. FedEx serves over 220 countries and territories.
That one's one of my favorites. All right, I'm gonna skip ahead actually because I don't want to run short on time. I want to leave you with some actionable takeaways today, things to keep in mind that you can take with you. And my first tip today is this: create opportunities for millennials to share their voice. Millennials often tell me, look, it's not about getting my idea implemented. It's just knowing I have a supervisor who's willing to listen to it, to take me seriously, to not treat me as some kid with some crazy ideas. I want to work in an environment where I know I can be heard. Create those opportunities. Those are the environments millennials thrive in and they want to stay in. Conversely, actually, let me give you a quick example of this. US Bank. We did some work with US Bank a few years ago. We were brought in as consultants. US Bank really wanted to understand the millennial consumer a little bit better. And so we went in there, and what we realized is that they were making decisions about the millennial consumer with no millennials at the table whatsoever. And we said, well, there's your number one problem. You have hundreds of millennials within the walls of this organization. Tap into that. So they started doing a program called the Dynamic Dozen, which is a group of millennials throughout the organization that serve as a sounding board for the senior leaders within the organization. And this group of people, which has been going on since 2009, and they filter in and out every year a new group, has been instrumental in implementing some great new technologies, apps, policies, procedures, both external and internal, and it has proved very successful. I want to give you a quote here. This is from Kent Stone, Vice Chairman of Consumer Banking at US Bank. He said, "We place tremendous value on the potential of the millennial generation, and this group is instrumental in making US Bank relevant to current and future millennial customers and employees." Look, this is a pretty grandiose and pretty amazing example of giving millennials a voice. You don't have to do anything as big as that. Sometimes it's as simple as inviting a millennial to a meeting they wouldn't ordinarily be invited to and asking for their feedback after. What did you think of that? How do you think that went? Give them a voice. Millennials, on the flip side, when I talk to senior leaders, they often tell me, look, it's not the ideas that are getting in millennials' way, it's how they're presenting them that's really their biggest deterrent. Present ideas and present change in a respectful way. Let me give you an example. It's something as easy as, I give the example of evolution versus revolution. Evolution means to improve upon, to make better. Revolution means to completely do away with and start over. So if you go to a supervisor and say, the way we do things around here is archaic and ridiculous. I can't believe we still use these programs. We need to get out of the Stone Age. I don't know if any of you have ever heard a millennial say something along those lines. That is not going to get you as far as saying, I did my homework. This new system would keep us compliant. It's user-friendly. I think it would really improve the way things are done. Can I show you how it works? That's evolution versus revolution. And I hear stories all the time. Quick little sidebar. Somebody came up to me, a millennial, after a speech and said, I'm really glad you came here today. I can feel the generational tension here where I work. My boss hates me. I said, I don't think your boss hates you. That's a little dramatic. He's like, I'm pretty sure he hates me. I don't know why, but he hates me. Later on, and I had dinner with people and stuff later on, I figured out who the boss was. And I went up and I talked to him, and I couldn't resist. So I'm just like, oh, I talked to so-and-so earlier. Oh, so-and-so? Oh, I hate that kid. Well, got to the bottom of that. When I asked why, he said that millennial had started, and within 2 weeks, started, as he put it, running his mouth about some program that this baby boomer had implemented about 10 years earlier and was saying how ridiculous and outdated it was. Millennials, you have to be cognizant of who's in the room and who's hearing these ideas that you have and how you are presenting them, because once that wall goes up, it is hard to bring it back down. And not only is that idea going to get shot down, but even future ideas are going to get shot down. Present ideas and change in the most respectful way possible. And we have to keep in mind, too, that As a younger generation, it's easy for us to walk in and think we have the best and the brightest ideas, but boomers, the youngest boomers are only 51 years old. They are, as mentioned earlier, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They're not slowing down anytime soon. They still remain hardworking. They still remain competitive, but they do it with this very optimistic and youthful spirit. Pepsi tapped into that optimism and youthfulness with this next commercial.
Here come those darn hippies again.
Test 1, 2, 1, check, check. Okay, stay away from the green pesto sauce. It's a real bummer.
Is that you, Sunflower? Pigpen?
Place hasn't changed in 25 years.
Yeah, it's a shame. You know, they should have put in some condos by now.
I'm on a low sodium, low fat diet.
Well, how do you feel?
Terrible.
The green marble goes in the upstairs bathroom.
This is the anniversary of a historic event. Which one? Watergate.
A warm welcome for Country Joe McDonald.
Joe, remember when we did this 25 years ago?
No.
Wouldn't it be nice if your youth was as easy to hold on to as an ice cold Pepsi?
You think I'll go skinny dipping again?
Yeah!
I hope not.
All right, boomers, that was just for you. Xers, let's take some time and talk about our generation. Unfortunately, because of time, I can't hop down there and Phil Donahue our events and conditions, but I want to give everyone a little synopsis of the formative years of the Generation Xers in the room. Across the globe, things were taking a shift in terms of the overall attitude and atmosphere in the world. We were the first generation that was told we wouldn't do as well as our parents. And right out of the gate, before we even got into the workplace, we're thinking, well, good to know. You know, doesn't give us a lot to look forward to. We started with a very skeptical outlook, and we've had a hard time shaking it ever since. In terms of the world, one of the main things we have to talk about when it comes to our formative years was the explosion of media. Media exploded across the globe. More TVs were being sold. I mean, boomers, you remember having maybe that one TV in the house, or maybe you remember getting your first color TV. But it was usually that big wooden console that sat in the middle of the room. With Xers, we started to get portable TVs, TV dinners took off, VCRs, camcorders. We'd have multiple TVs in the house, maybe one in the rec room, one in the kitchen. It was just, media was exploding, and with more televisions came more channels. It is said that by the age of 20, the average Gen Xer viewed 23,000 hours of TV. That's a lot of TV. What the heck were we watching? But you got to keep in mind, you know, sitcoms were all over the map. MTV in the United States became a thing. In Canada and other parts of the world, you had much music. We had music videos. Millennials, MTV is a network that used to play music videos. Music videos are video interpretations of something. No, I'm kidding. What's funny, too, is I think that first year they maybe had 7 videos that they played, just kind of on a loop. And we didn't care. We loved it. But if you missed a video, you couldn't go to YouTube and watch it. You just sat there and waited for them to play it again. It was a big deal. What else? Ted Turner invented CNN during our formative years. So suddenly we had 24-hour news. We were the first generation to have that. In the US, Walter Cronkite was dubbed the most trusted man in America, most trusted man in news. And now we had people like Geraldo Rivera. It was just it was a kind of a shift. And when you're a 24-hour news network, you need something to talk about for 24 hours. This is really a period of time when we started to see the curtain get pulled back a little on a lot of different institutions around the globe. It didn't matter if it was corporate, it could be Enron, WorldCom, it could be political. In the US, some Xers are old enough that they can remember one president saying, "I am not a crook." It's a spot on Nixon, by the way, thank you. But we can also remember another president saying, "I did not have," you remember. Turns out neither was true. It didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat. Nobody was not being put under a microscope at that time. sports scandals. There were all kinds of different things going down globally at that time. It really led us to be a skeptical generation. We're that generation that's always waiting for the other shoe to drop. We don't take things at face value because we grew up in a time where you can't put too much stock in something because we would just be let down. It seemed like something would always happen, something would go wrong. In the United States, Milli Vanilli got exposed as lip syncers. Our bands weren't even singing anymore. Come on. Our athletes were on trial. It was just a time where we really started to question everything around us. You want to know how skeptical an Xer is? According to a third millennium survey, Gen Xers believe they're more likely to see a UFO in their lifetime than a Social Security check. So we don't, thank you, we don't exactly have an optimistic and idealistic outlook on things the way boomers before us did. On the home front, things weren't looking up. The divorce rate tripled during our formative years. And in many parts of the world, there was a huge spike in latchkey kids. You'd have that with more women going back to work too during this time. After school, there was sometimes a couple hours to kill before mom and dad got home from work. So latchkey kids really took off during this time. And latchkey kids, you know, you got a system down. Some latchkey kids, you babysat your brother or sister, you had chores to do, you did your homework, you made a snack, you played a video game, watched cartoons. Whatever it is you were doing it on your own time. You were doing it without supervision. No one was there to micromanage. No one was there to say, do it this way, do it that way. No one was there to give you a gold star when you did your homework or put the dishes away. We just did it. We became a very self-sufficient generation at a very young age. When we look at the lasting traits of a Gen Xer, among others, we are self-reliant, skeptical, entrepreneurial, and independent. And it's that independent spirit that we really see in the workplace today, across industries. Xers, ever since we were young, we've had that self-reliant way about us. And now in the workplace, well, let me give you an example. Boomers, you tend to do really well on committees. You conduct meetings. Millennials are a very collaborative generation. Xers, we tend to be the ones in a meeting who have that look on our face that says, why do we need to be here? Or how much longer is this meeting going to go? Think about how we were raised, millennials especially. When you were growing up, it was all about two heads are better than one. There's no I in team. All kinds of different motivational posters all over the classroom. Xers, what were we told? If you want something done right, do it yourself. That's not very motivating, but that's what we were told. So today in the workplace, when we're given a project, something to work on, we say, all right, great, you tell me what you need, you tell me when you need it. Great, I'm going to go over here and work on that. Hopefully you are going to go over there. And then when I'm done, we'll get back together and go over it. And millennials tend to have more of a, hey, let's work on this together. Let's brainstorm. Let's come up with some ideas. Let's go get a coffee and talk about this. We'll hash it out and we'll come up with something great. Neither one is right. Neither one is wrong. It's just a different way of doing things. So when working with Xers, recognize Xers' need for independence. We've had that self-reliant spirit since we were very, very young. Recognize that collaboration, while we can do it, we might enjoy it, we might be very good at it sometimes, it's not our go-to. It's not always going to be our go-to. Keep that in mind, because we don't thrive in environments where we feel micromanaged, where we feel somebody is over our shoulder. We really like that time to ourselves. On the flip side, Xers, as we're starting to really grow into more managerial and leadership roles, recognize where you can collaboration. Recognize where collaboration can be beneficial. You're going to be managing more and more millennials who thrive and produce in collaborative environments. So find those opportunities to open the door, to work outside of the bubble, because that's going to be just as important. Another thing I want you to keep in mind with Xers is our skeptical attitude. And it creeps out in the workplace all the time in ways we can't always anticipate. We question things. We push back. And a lot of boomers think, whoa, I didn't ask all these questions when my bosses came to me with things. I never talked to my boss that way. Millennials think, why don't you like me? Why are you being so mean to me? But we push back, we question, we poke holes, we ask tough questions. Let me give you an example. I love when I'm the cliche and I'm supposed to be the guy who knows better. Hannah and I, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, we were doing, I was doing a speech. And I had written a script. And all my scripts are a little bit different wherever I'm speaking, depending on who's in the audience. And I gave it to her. I'm like, will you read this and just tell me, are these good takeaways? Is it funny? Did I pick good videos? What do you think? As a millennial, would you enjoy that? She went through it. She's like, oh, this looks really good. In this one section right here, I remember she said, you should really talk more about social media. Really expand on it. Give them some good tips. Give them some good meat, some statistics. They'll love it. I remember saying, okay, well, are we social media experts? What kind of statistics do we have? Am I qualified to stand up there and talk about that? So what, I tell them all to get on Twitter and in 2 years Twitter's not a thing anymore? Social media is transient, Hannah, so why would I? Finally she put her hands up and said, I get it. You hate it. Don't do it. And this is where it gets weird. I said, no, I think it's a great idea. I'm totally gonna do it. What makes you say that? And then she looked at me like I was insane. I thought we were just talking. She thought I was screaming at her. So I ask Xers when we do interviews, I'm like, why do you do that? Why do you push back, poke holes, ask questions? And the number one answer I get from Xers, I push back and I ask tough questions because I actually care about what we're doing here. And that's a very important distinction to make with Xers. Don't ever mistake that skepticism for apathy. We care a great deal about what we're doing. We just tend to do it in a more honest and unfiltered sort of a manner. I feel like I'm doing a bad job talking about my generation. Let's see. We're mean to millennials. We don't like to work with other people. We're skeptical. We push back. Xers are actually a very thoughtful, fun, hardworking generation, and we can let our hair down from time to time. The tricky thing about Xers is we tend to do that when we don't think anyone else is paying attention.
Is that me? Was I singing?
I've been that guy. All right, we have a short amount of time left. And by the way, just to let everyone know, I'm doing a question and answer session after this where they're going to have details after I'm done. So hopefully you can all come to that. I'd love to take your questions. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that we talked about today. So hopefully you can all attend that. Really quick, millennials. One more time, millennials. Let's hear you. Where are you at? I want to talk a little bit about your formative years because things really changed during this time across the globe. Millennials are the generation that you can't talk about without talking about technology. Technology just changed the way that this generation does everything, the way they buy, sell, communicate, share, you name it. But what it really did is it changed the rate of change for this generation. Let me tell you what I mean. I talk to millennials who can remember being little kids and playing on this. How many of you recognize this old Macintosh computer? Now, I feel I'm in a room full of people who are way smarter than I am, but just in case you're not maybe the most tech savvy when it comes to old technology, the total storage of this thing is 128 kilobytes. Your laughter tells me you get it. That's roughly the size of a tweet on Twitter today. That's it. Those same millennials will tell me that they remember getting to college or university and getting their first generation iPhone. This thing can download ringtones 10 times the size of that Macintosh computer. You are looking at huge advancements in technology in what is, can we be honest, a very short amount of time. Did you hear on the news this morning? Apple is finding a way to eliminate voicemail. You would just leave a voicemail on the phone? Oh yes, some people do not like voicemail. I know millennials who are offended at the thought of leaving a voicemail. How dare you make me go into my mailbox? You don't even have to type the code in anymore. It's right there. No, Apple is finding a way that Siri is going to be able to translate and just send you a text message of what the voicemail was. Don't you see that as being challenging in terms of tone and context? Hey, just wondering where you are. And it's going to read, where are you? Hurry up. So many fights are about to break out. Another thing I want to mention really briefly about the millennial generation in terms of your formative years. Across the globe, this generation experienced violence very differently than generations before them. Now, every generation experienced violence, terrorism, war, homeland and otherwise. But millennials were the generation that, here in the United States, they were in their formative years when 9/11 happened, the 7/7 bombings, when school shootings really started to, since Columbine and the countless others that have happened since. Violence wasn't in other countries, it wasn't happening somewhere else, it was in the desks next to them. And millennials have told me that this was a period in their life where they could feel their parents, figuratively and literally, hugging them tighter, holding them closer, because the world had become such a scary place. And it's during this time that we really saw a huge rise in a style of parenting you might have heard of. How many of you in here, by a round of applause, have heard of helicopter parenting? It's got a pretty negative connotation to it today, but at the time the idea was, look, we just want to make sure everyone's safe and feeling good. The world is scary. Everyone is scared and sad, and these terrible things are happening. I don't want the world to be any worse for you than it needs to be, so I'm always here. And if something's going wrong, I'm there. I'm swooping down. And heck, you look at the role of a guidance counselor in a public school, how much that changed. It went from class schedules and college transcripts to part counselor, or not counselor, social worker, really. Millennials were brought up during a time where they were encouraged to speak up, to talk. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How does that make you feel? They had those close relationships with not just counselors, but with coaches, with teachers, priests, rabbis, you name it. Millennials early on had very close relationships with people in positions of authority. Very informal relationships with people in positions of authority. They felt very close with them. But with nobody was that relationship closer than with mom and dad. Millennials grew up very close with their parents. Even as an Xer, there were things I just didn't talk to my parents about a lot of times. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to figure that one out for myself. Thanks anyway. Millennials, it seemed nothing was off the table. Very close relationships. And I really want to show that commercial, but we're so short on time, so I'm just going to cut to it. Millennial traits. We are looking at a generation that is collaborative, tech-savvy, globally diverse, and socially accepting. And when we look at what do millennials value? Oops. It's choice, efficiency, integrity, and customization. I'd say right now the number one question I get asked about millennials is about motivation. What motivates this generation? Or rather, how come what motivated me when I was coming up in the workplace doesn't seem to motivate them? So many different industries right now, so many different fields, yours is no exception, really want to engage this generation. And the best way to do that with any generation is to find out what motivates them. And it's just a different time today. If you look at what motivated a boomer, what motivated a Generation Xer, it was very different. In 1960, in the United States, 59% of adults under 30 were married. Today, 20% of adults under 30 are married. We're finding life stage for millennials is very, very different. So the idea that for boomers, motivation came in the form of supporting a family, paying a mortgage, making car payments, putting clothes on your family's back. Those were your motivations. Millennials aren't hitting that life stage until much later. So those aren't necessarily the same things that they need to worry about. We live in a time now where the shared economy is really taking off. Clap if you've ever heard of the term the shared economy. The shared economy refers to the idea, it's sometimes known as the end of ownership, where, well, think of Uber, think of Lyft, think of car-to-go. The idea that if I'm a millennial, I don't need a car, especially if I live in any kind of a big city or urban area. I can get rid of that car and I don't have a payment. I don't have to pay insurance. I don't have to pay for gas. I don't have to pay for repairs. All of that's done. I don't need to buy a big cable package or get some big subscription. For $8 a month, I can have Netflix, share that password with 12 friends, and call it a day. I don't have to go to an expensive, fancy hotel. You know what I can do? I can go on Airbnb. And you know what? If I want to make some extra money, people can use Airbnb to stay at my place. It's the shared economy, and it cuts down on expenses in a way that really millennials don't have the same financial obligations coming into the workplace that boomers had. They're motivated by so many other things, including the fact that 39% of millennials still receive some form of financial assistance from a baby boomer parent. There's a little bit of that cushion there too, a little bit of a parachute. So what we're finding is that for millennials, money alone isn't motivating this generation the way it once did with other generations. What we're finding is one of the big motivators for millennials is meaning. They want meaning in what they do. They want to work in industries where they feel they are making a difference. That is so important to this generation. Meaning really is the new money. And when I say that, make no mistake. One, boomers, Xers, I know that we want to do meaningful work. We're like, we want to do meaningful work. Absolutely. But a lot of us, when we came into the workplace, we put our heads down, kept our mouths shut, and we kind of waited till we ascended into more meaningful roles where we could enact change. And with millennials, that's not the case. They're going to speak up right away, and we already talked about why that is. And I'm also not saying millennials, don't worry. I'm not trying to tell your supervisors that they can pay you in hugs and feelings coupons. You want to make money, but it's not what is getting you out of bed in the morning. One of my favorite questions to ask millennials is, what do you love most about your job? And I wanted to share a few answers before I said goodbye. This is from a millennial in London. Why am I here? It's to make a difference. It's to do something that matters. This is from a millennial in India. I took this job because I believe it actually matters. I believe I have the potential to make a difference, not just on the team, not on the company, but on a larger scale. And this next one comes from China. Money won't make you happy forever. It can't always be the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. And in Minneapolis, my hometown, my work really matters. It helps me feel passionate about what I do because I'm educating people on something they're often overwhelmed with. There is so much meaning and purpose in what you do. Really showcase that to millennials and let them know what you do here matters on a big scale. You're part of something very, very big. That is something that speaks to millennials. Unfortunately, I have to cut things short, so hopefully as many of you can attend the Q&A after this and we can talk a little bit more about millennials. I can answer your questions as best as I can. But before I do that, I just have to say to everyone at APS who helped bring me in, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for having me here today. I want to leave you with one final thought. When it comes to working across generations, working with millennials, Xers, baby boomers, even traditionalists, we have to get it out of our heads that it's about right or wrong, better or worse. It's not about that. It's about understanding that each and every single generation is bringing something different, useful, and valuable to the table. But it's up to us to tap into that. So with that, I say thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.